Welcome to Serco Middle East virtual roundtable session, where today we are discussing, can outsourcing save the transport industry? I'm your host, Laura Kelly. I'm the Business Transformation Director at Serco Middle East. And today on our panel, we have Peter Mohring, Transport MD, Paul Bogan, our Chief Digital Officer, Kristine Pitts, ExperienceLab Director, Gary Malone, our Transport Operations Director, and Bryan Thompson, Aviation Consultant. Thank you all for joining me today.
Thank you, Laura.
The transport industry has been under a lot of economic pressure, and at Serco, we believe outsourcing can help in the recovery period and beyond. This industry needs to reimagine outsourcing. The world has changed, and the transport industry needs to adapt. So we are ready for takeoff. Pete, over to you. How has the transport sector been impacted by the pandemic?
Thanks, Laura. Well, it's had a significant impact, obviously, in the global transport sector. That's across land, sea, and air. And in particular, it sent the aviation industry into crisis almost overnight, with an overall air traffic levels down by about 80% globally. And obviously, this comes with huge economic impact on the industry and all its adjacent segments. Tourism and hospitality, and the multiple supply chain industry that supports that sector. In the short term, the immediate actions that we saw from customers were consistent with what you'd expect in a crisis mode: postponing capex and opex investment, cost containment exercises, including suspending outsourcing supply chain contractors, emphasis on optimizing assets and lifecycle management, and halting recruitment and training and reducing workforce numbers. So 3 key areas where it's had an immediate impact.
Thanks, Pete. And Bryan, what do you think the industry has learned from this pandemic?
Well, Laura, I think one of the issues that they've addressed quite quickly is the fact that they have to learn how to become more scalable from a human resource perspective, and also how they can use trusted partnerships to both protect the operation during times of trouble, but then also add to the customer experience during, when things are good. So I think one of the learnings that we had, particularly from an airport perspective, was to, in the first phase, not overreact, but also how you can leverage those key partnerships rather than, and Pete was quite right, the first thing you go to is how do you protect liquidity, how do you reduce your costs, both OPEX and CAPEX. But, the one thing I think we've learned from the industry perspective is how do you then start to work together with trusted partners, such as Serco, to be able to create that ratcheting effect, to ratchet up when you need it and ratchet down when you can't afford it anymore. So, again, I don't think the lessons are fully learned yet. I think people are still learning the lessons as we go through the crisis. And I think initiatives such as this to create environments where we can continue to learn, create new ways of working, and then form new partnerships after this are going to be crucial.
And I mean, I guess one thing that we are sure of is that, travel will return, passengers will come back, and people are going to be more reassured. Kristine, the ExperienceLab recently did a bit of research into this. What did that tell us?
Yeah, building on what Bryan was saying there around customer experience, one of the things that we saw from the research that we did is how much reassurance people are looking for from the travel providers, whether and the whole travel industry, regardless of whether that's the airline, the airport, or the destination that you're heading to. People's priorities were changing at the beginning of the year, and some of the things that have happened with the crisis is that people they're really concerned about their safety when they travel. So you have people who would normally be very comfortable traveling, who would normally maybe travel several times a month, suddenly finding themselves actually anxious about what is needed, what information do I need, what are the travel documents that I require, do I need a test? There's a lot of question marks around travel. And so some of what we saw was the lack of consistency and across both government and also the travel industry itself on the messaging, what's being provided, how are the services being delivered, can you actually see is there a standard for what makes you safe on a plane or an airport or any of those areas that you go through as a traveler? What's a safe destination? Does it matter what they've implemented in terms of requirements on the ground when you arrive? And people were actively considering this as part of their when they're choosing where to go. In terms of our travel survey, we had out of all of our respondents, we had around 83% who said, I'm not probably going to be very quick to get back on a plane and travel because I'm feeling unsafe or insecure about traveling. However, there's some big drivers for getting back on that plane and getting back on out and travel. Like 43% of people said they would still go if it was for the purposes of seeing family. So that reunion after so long apart is often the driving force for people starting to travel now. But you also had around 16% who were just desperate to get back out there, and they're the ones who are less concerned about the safety of travel, but more concerned about choosing destinations that are going to cater for that. And I think one of the things that we need to see in terms of passengers coming back is how do the destinations and the airline and every part of the travel industry and the transport industry respond to that. And I think at the moment what's really lacking is that consistent messaging, the consistent response, and the consistent way of keeping people safe that reassures passengers that actually their health and safety is being looked after.
Yeah. I mean, just on that point, on sort of like, people's personal safety, Paul, as our sort of chief digital officer, I think we've seen a number of new technologies taken off that keep transportation workers safe during the coronavirus and perhaps beyond that. What are we seeing there?
Really good question. Thank you, Laura. I would like to say though, like first and foremost, I believe it is prudent to remind everyone that the best form of keeping all workers safe, at this stage is still through the right behaviours and best practice when it comes to the prevention of both the infection and the spread. That said, where we really see technology enabling and supporting the safety of the frontline workers is both an adaptation of existing technologies and then sort of some of the newer technology we're seeing being implemented to support, as I said, the safety of the workers. So when you look at contactless touch points, we see these implemented at most ingress and egress points to sort of minimise social and physical interaction. That is something that I'll see is retaining and improving upon post-COVID, even something as simple as cashless payments. I think we'll see start to change in the future. I think the governments alone have done a lot, certainly done a lot here in the UAE with their own applications. These are really important for contact tracing. The applications themselves are real preventative measures against the spread of that infection. They provide real-time information and advice, which is administered from authority to individuals on best practice. And it covers a wide range of things from mental health perspective to advice on what to do, where and when. So I think those are two big enabled solutions that are there in the market that have been adapted and pivoted towards supporting COVID. I think some of the latest technologies that we see are really centred around mitigation. So using a lot of the existing CCTV and alarm networks to prevent crowding whilst leveraging computer vision being sort of a subset of AI and computer science. And we're using that now for temperature scanning, see most of us doing when we enter an exit at demise, and alarming when social distancing norms are exceeded. I think medium to long term, what we're going to see is fundamental policy changes across transportation clients. I think the policy will be looking at how you assess the performance of that consumer service to ensure they're streamlined, more responsive, using business process automation, using robotics and other tools that are delivered via digital means, and again, to try and minimise touch points where possible.
Thank you, Paul. That's really interesting insights there. Pete, I'll come back to you because the title of this session is how outsourcing can help the sector to get back on track. But firstly, how has the sector been outsourcing up until now?
I think to Bryan's point, earlier, the old rule book for, in fact, in terms of airports, the way that they operated in a lot of different segments, but particularly outsourcing, simply won't apply going forward, because the traditional fixed pricing of input-based, output-based with variable metrics simply isn't going to meet the needs of clients going forward. And from what we understand in our discussions with clients across all segments in that sort of aviation ecosystem, is that they're looking for flexibility, they're looking for scalability, and they're looking for outsourcing companies like Serco to come up with innovative ways of reducing costs, but not degrading a service. So the traditional methods we're even seeing now at where we're offering proposals for customers to customers and clients, they're looking at these and saying, well, that's interesting. We hadn't looked at that before. And some of the more mature clients are actually demanding that we revisit some of the outsourcing solutions.
And Gary, you've been working at airports now for a long time. Where do you see the value in outsourcing for airports going forward?
I suppose airports and airlines are being forced to go through major transformation projects. In an industry, particularly in this region, that has joined exponential growth for years. Prior to COVID, the issues facing the airports were to help deal and plan with growth, additional capacity, and how to attract the best talent into the region. I suppose the challenge in the short term is to react to the global recovery and changing landscape within the regions. That's driven by local lockdowns across various countries and constantly changing travel restrictions. So outsourced services with flexible commercial models, like Pete mentioned earlier, they'll allow customers to call off manpower and associated services as required as the fluctuations continue. This gives airports the opportunity to reduce their OPEX cost and utilize the service of proven outsourced providers like Serco, and in turn, importantly, improve service delivery. And the overarching piece of that is that outsourced service providers can carry the risk of further fluctuations in resources and service requirement, allowing airports to keep their core teams focused on the recovery strategies.
Yeah, and Pete, maybe if I come back to you, specifically Serco as a provider of outsourced services, how have we been making sure that we're adhering to government's requirements and the new sort of COVID restrictions in the delivery of our services?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Kristine touched on a little bit before around that it's challenging because of particularly in the customer safety and well-being sector, around changing requirements, and often those requirements are changing quite quickly. But historically, Serco is very, very familiar in the business to governments sector across a number of transport sectors, regionally and globally. Land, air, and sea. So we're really familiar working in a highly regulated and compliance safety industry. So stakeholder engagement with the regulators, with the clients, is something that it comes naturally to us. And of course, just from a policy perspective, Serco, at Serco, we just take the responsibility of that duty of care for the safety and well-being of the travelling public. It's huge, and as is the same duty of care to our own staff, and we take it really, really seriously. We've got a really robust set of SOPs, standard operating procedures, that we can flex to meet local government, health authorities, and client requirements.
Thanks, Pete. And just that sort of working collaboratively with partners, Paul, we're looking a lot at sort of digital asset management at the moment, but also how can sort of technologies at this time help inform collaborative decision making?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Laura. Thank you very much. And I think you alluded to asset management. I think asset management is absolutely key with respect to looking at collaborative decision making. So let me just quickly define that. Asset management is a systematic process. It's a methodology. It's how you extrapolate economic value from the assets. Digital asset management, when we talk about that, is really about leveraging data and technology pertaining to the performance, the safety, or criticality of those assets, and using this to drive improved asset performance to deliver lower total cost of ownership, reducing asset replacement values, better certainty, which I think Bryan alluded to, of CapEx and OpEx spend, certainly in this period. But it's all really through about extending economic life. Outsourcing, having the right partner that understands best in practice, leverages the latest processes, is going to drive that value. If facility management or operations and maintenance services are still using time or usage-based measures, then the impact to the business is that it's still seen as an expense, not an investment. And I think by having the right partner, by using data to drive, which is essentially what a collaborative and decision-making tool is, they really start understanding, what data sets to collect so that you can move up that maturity curve, so that it is an investment. You start moving up condition-based maintenance to risk-based maintenance towards more predictive maintenance solutions. So you have just-in-time services at the most economic price for how these services are delivered. And I think that will start to provide far more value for our customers, for partners here in the UAE.
Thank you, Paul. I mean, we've talked quite a lot so far around the actual airports and the airport sort of infrastructure, the assets, as Paul mentions there. But Bryan, maybe I could come to you and just say, where's this all? How has this all landed with the actual airlines? Where are they, and how do we get them back into the airspace?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's work in progress. I don't think the airlines are quite, it's back to the point that's been made again around changing regulations worldwide. So you have both for the airlines coping with changing regulation in the domestic home market for them, but then if you take an airline that flies to 50 destinations, they've got the scale of that with changing regulation at 50 points of arrival. Without a global standard at the moment, particularly for how passengers should travel between different ports, it's becoming increasingly difficult for airlines to manage. And I think there is, again, a digital means where that could help in the long run. But in the short run, each different regulator is coming up with a different way of doing things. And I don't think that's been particularly helpful for the airlines because they're struggling to get going. Australia have got restrictions in terms of numbers of passengers that can arrive into quarantine facilities. So, airlines are battling to, they can't fill their airplanes. And then on destinations where they can fill their airplanes, regulations are changing, so passengers are reluctant to fly. So it's a moving feast at the moment, and the airlines are in that phase now where they're looking at how do they contain the costs. It's an incredibly difficult time. Looking at, if we can, probably the opportunities and positives that come out of this, both for airlines and airports, is that you've almost seen this contractual reset. All the rule books have been thrown out the window. And there is this time now for companies such as Serco that have got the breadth of service delivery across many different portfolios to be able to come together and say, we can give you a single solution. Historically, both airports and airlines have outsourced almost incrementally as they've got to a service point where they think they can outsource it. They've outsourced it, and they've gone to a service provider that can provide them a cleaning contract or a facilities management contract or people to work on experience and customer experience type related activities. Now you have this contractual reset where you could come to somebody like Serco and look across the breadth of services and come up with a single contract that allows you to scale across each of those. So I think there's opportunities in this. I mean, it's a terrible time. It's a terrible time for the industry, particularly if you have a look out there in terms of employment numbers. But if we can look at how do we assist that in the medium to longer term by creating jobs with companies such as Serco that can come and fill the gap as the airlines start to return to the air. So I think, yeah, it's been a difficult time. I don't think we're completely through the learning just yet in terms of what we can take out of this. But strategically, there must be some form of value in terms of filling the gap, particularly when we return to some form of normal.
Thank you, Bryan. Yeah. And Kristine, I'm going to come back to you just to sort of wrap up. I mean, we have looked a lot at sort of cost savings, of efficiency, but what about that passenger experience? How can outsourcing improve the passenger experience?
Yeah, so it's hardly going to be surprising that my perspective is passenger experience here is key. It's never been more important. Passengers are feeling very insecure about the travel experience, and the more any part of that travel industry can do to make them feel comfortable and safe, the quicker they're going to come back and get that confidence to travel. But that needs to cover things like consistency of information, consistency of experience and expectations. And where that's not possible, providing the right level of information so that people have the things they need to be able to plan their travel accordingly. Governments are not necessarily going to all align overnight. So how can that be made easier for people to understand? And I think where Serco as an outsourcer, for example, is where it provides something that might be really, well, is likely to be very useful, is we're not just looking at one industry. So when we look at passenger experience or customer experience, we're looking at it across a number of different industries. We're taking learnings from how people are, we're making people feel safe and protected in a mall, and we can reapply that to other areas, whether it's a metro service or if it's an airport service. There's a lot of crossover between those different types of passenger experience or customer experiences. And it's also taking that learning, but being there to help you implement it. So our combination of having that customer experience capability, as well as our operational side, is really where the value of Serco's offering comes in. And I think that's something that can be really put to use in the current context.
Mm-hmm. Just that customer service approach to everything, I think, is going to be really important going forward. So that concludes our session for today. So it's just to thank everybody for watching and to thank our panelists. And you can find out more about Serco Middle East on our website.